Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the Walsh family. Grandpa and Grandma Walsh, married in 1895. First child was Katherine. Katherine was born in 1896. She died New Year's Eve of 1901 of spinal meningitis. 1904, rather, excuse me, of spinal meningitis. I did find a tiny obituary, about 2 lines. About all that it said was she was the daughter of Robert Welsh, and she died around 6:15 on a Saturday night, which was New Year's Eve. One thing to keep in mind if you're doing any research, the name Walsh, W-A-L-S-H, in America is pronounced Walsh. In Ireland, that's pronounced Welsh, because it means either a Welshman or an Englishman. In 1169, there was an English king invaded Ireland, and a bunch of soldiers came with him. They became known as the Welshmen. So there are a lot of people named Walsh who are not necessarily related, but it's all part of those who came over from England to begin with. So that's what's known as the Anglo-Irish. But anyway, Katherine died in 1904. I remember Aunt Gertrude talking about it. She remembered it and was buried in South Creek. The funeral was pretty much a do-it-yourself type thing. The neighboring women came in and arranged the body, and I suppose somebody built a casket. I doubt they bought one already made. I suppose it was one they built, and then they buried her in the churchyard in South Creek. There is a picture I have. We do have one picture of her. There's also a picture of the dedication of the church in South Creek, and they were there. Of course, you can't pick them out, but she was wearing a white dress, and when the holy water was sprinkled, a little got on her dress, and she tended to brush it off. I remember Grandma talking about that. And of course, anytime New Year's Eve came, Grandma always remembered how long it had been since she had died. And then the second child was Aunt Gertrude, who, after she grew up, married John Harms. She was like a grandmother to us. They had no children, but she was easygoing. We could do things there we couldn't get away with at home. She didn't care. But she was very kind to all of us. She did a lot for us. Louise and I stayed there and went to school in Sioux City. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to do that because the roads were such you couldn't have commuted in those days. Unfortunately, she died young at age 63 of cancer. And then the third child was William, who was born in 1904. When he grew up, he joined the Navy. In 1927, he went to the Navy, traveled all over the world. We do have a few pictures. They weren't ones that he took. There's some that he bought. There's some of Panama, for instance, and things like that. And there were some places like Burma and China and things like that, because he'd been all over the world. He went home on leave with a man from Kentucky, and that's where he met his wife and his future wife, and then eventually they got married. And when he got out of the Navy, settled in Louisville. Louisville had a tremendous flood in 1937, and I think that's what caused him to leave Louisville and move to Campbellsville, which is where his wife was from. So they had several children, Pat and Bob, Louis, Lawrence, Rose, and William. And they're all living except Bob. Bob died of cancer back in 1976, I think it was. Pat is about 85 years old, and she's still living in her house in Greensburg. Lawrence became the police chief in Greensburg, in Lexington rather, until he retired. And then he moved to Greensburg, a small town close to where they grew up, where Pat also lives. Louis lives in Clinton Township, New York, just outside of Clinton Township, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And he's still working. He's 75 years old, but he's still working. He's somewhat of a workaholic. I haven't seen much of him. A time or two when they were on the way to Wyoming to hunt antelope, he stopped in. And Lawrence comes every now and then. Lawrence is retired. He travels a lot. William has been here, I think, once or twice, but it's a long time ago. He was a cop most of his life, state police, and then he became a deputy sheriff after that happened, after he retired from that. But he's retired completely now. Rose lives in a town called Fort Thomas, Kentucky, right across the river from Cincinnati. She is a nurse, and by now she has retired. She has 2 children. Of course, they're grown up by now. Don't hear from Rose that much, but every now and then, we usually get a Christmas card from her. And then there's Aunt Margaret, who married Marvin Merchant. They had 3 children. Mary Lou, who is 90 years old, she'll be 91 Friday, still living in her house in Ponca. They were married, she and her husband were married for, well, close to 70 years when he died. He died a couple of years ago, but she's still living. And she had 5 children. I think it's 5, Karen, Patsy, Linda, 6 children, Ray and Ralph and John. Patsy has died. Patsy was a childhood diabetic, type 1 diabetes, and had a lot of problems. And a few years ago, she was in the hospital and was doing pretty well, but had a heart attack and died. So, but the rest of them, Karen lives in Spirit Lake, Iowa. The rest all live around here. And then there was Peggy. Peggy was the second child. She married Marlon Millard. They had 4 children. Peggy died a few years ago. She was diabetic too. I don't know if it's complications of that or if they ever did determine exactly what the cause of death was, but she has died. She's buried in Hubbard. And Dick, of course, got out of high school in 1958, joined the Marines, and it was a short stint in the Marines. I think it was like 6 months is all. And then he came home, and he was working in an equipment place. And one night in October of 1959, he was driving home from Sioux City, and a drunk plowed into him, and he died as a result. So he's buried in St. Michael's Cemetery. And then Margaret and Marvin are both buried down there too. And then, of course, Aunt Mary, and you know about her family. And then there's us, the 3 of us, Ronnie, Louise, Donnie. We're still... Louise got married in 1963, had 6 children, and 24 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. 10 great-grandchildren? Oh, 10 great-grandchildren, okay. So they all keep quite busy doing various things. Most of them live close, except Lisa, who lives in Council Bluffs, which is only 100 miles away. And when we were young, we were together an awfully lot, all of us. We used to go over to the river for picnics in the summer, at various times. We'd go out close to the river. And I remember one day we were out there for a picnic, and We went down towards the river, walked down the river. We were just dying of thirst when we got back. Wanted to get back to the picnic area and get a drink of water. Well, we got back to the picnic area and the water was all gone. So we had to wait till we got to somebody's house. Of course, by then we were where cars were. So we'd go out there, and then 4th of July, we'd always get together. And one year we went out to the river on the 4th of July, and I fell in. We were fishing. It wasn't actually the river. At that time, the Corps of Engineers was doing a lot of work on the river, and they had places dammed off, and I fell into one of those, so it wasn't running water. But I just crawled out again. It wasn't any big deal, but I did fall into it. And then we'd have fireworks at night. Of course, when we were small, there were no fireworks because it was during World War II. I didn't know what a firecracker was until I was a pretty good age. But then firecrackers became available, legal. So we'd get firecrackers and shoot them all day, 4th of July, and at night the various things, sparklers, Roman candles, rockets, you name it. And then we had an Uncle Nels, my dad's brother, and Uncle Fred's brother, half-brother. He lived with them most of the time, lived with us part of the time. But he was, I guess you could say, adventuresome. He loved fireworks, and he was always puttering at something. I remember one year he had built an elaborate stand to shoot the rockets, made out of I think it was made out of a gutter pipe, but anyway, you could put the rocket in there and shoot it, and away it'd go. And he loved things like that. And he liked to hunt, and he liked to fish. And we used to go fishing in the river. We'd go over there to Fred's farm, take the pickup, and the kids would be in the back, and the dogs would watch. If it turned left, that meant going to town. The dogs would stay home. If it turned right, that meant going to the river. The dogs would follow. And they always had 3 dogs. They had one dog, Tip, who had lost a foot in a mower accident, but it didn't bother him. He got around just as well as any of the other dogs did. And then there was Sport, and Gertrude's dog was a black and white dog she called Hun-Bun. So the dogs were there, and of course the cats were there. They had a lot of cats and pigeons. There weren't so many pigeons over there, but we had a lot of pigeons at home, so sometimes Shirley and Gertrude would catch pigeons, take them over to their place. But I don't think the pigeons ever stayed very much or increased over there. But around home, we'd have a flock of about 50. We don't have them anymore because, for one thing, there's no open corn cribs. The corn's all inside bins, so they don't have a food supply like they used to have. But we did a lot of fishing in the river, and sometimes in Crystal Lake. At that time, Crystal Lake was which is this lake right here, was a nice lake. But in 1952, there was a severe flood that plugged up all the springs in it. And they've talked about dredging it, but for one reason they don't is the lake is right in the flyway of the Sioux City Municipal Airport, and they don't want to encourage waterfowl, because the waterfowl can interfere with the aircraft. They can get sucked into the aircraft and kill the jet engines. So, and then too, the property around the lake has been built up with houses and things like that, and obviously the people who own it don't want to give it up. So there isn't much fishing here anymore, a little bit. But there's still waterfowl, but not like it used to be. But we used to do that. We'd always do that on 4th of July. And I remember in the fall going over to Fred's farm, and he'd always go out in the field somewhere and get a watermelon. watermelon, so we'd be eating watermelon. In those days when you thrashed oats, you'd pile the straw in a pile, and then in the winter it'd be hauled in and used for bedding mostly. There was no food value in it, but the cattle and the horses could be bedded in it. Well, then the next spring there'd be the place where the straw pile was, so the weeds wouldn't grow there. It was thick and was an ideal place for waiting melons. You could plant watermelons there, and you didn't have to weed them. You'd just open the space where the melon seed went, and you could have plenty of melons. So we used to like watermelons. And then the picnics were great, and we always got together holidays and Christmas one year. Those days the roads weren't kept open very well because the equipment wasn't available, and the county didn't have any money anyway, less like it does now. Didn't have any money. But I know one time we went over there, I think it was Thanksgiving, and Nels came down with the sled and horses and took us back to the house, which was a pretty good distance from the road. But anyway, we got in the sled. Mom fell out. She didn't get hurt or anything, but she fell out of the sled. And then I recall the one, and your mother and Gertrude remember this, but one Christmas Eve they went to midnight mass in Jackson with merchants who lived next door in the farm next door to them. And they coming back, they got stuck because the weather was really bad. It was snowing and drifting, and they had to walk quite a long ways. So ask them about that. They'll remember that. They had to walk quite a ways to get home from where they were stuck. And I remember one time we went over there. It was in the spring. In the spring, you couldn't travel much because the roads would be so muddy. Car couldn't navigate it. Well, one time we decided to go over there in the wagon, horses and wagons. There was a house down there by the road. Boyles lived in it. And we were coming along in the wagon drawn by the horses. And Dorothy, who was, a rather talkative individual, let's put it that way. She was out on her porch leaning out the road saying, "What's the matter? You're too hard up to drive the car? You have to drive the horses?" And Dad told her yes. But you couldn't drive the car on those roads. The roads were much too muddy. We could go somewhere in the morning, early in the morning, as long as we got back home. But you couldn't go anywhere in the middle of the day until it dried up in the spring. And then back in 1960, where we lived, they redid the road. They graded it and made it much higher, so we don't have that problem now. It still can get messy, but it's always possible to go. And now it has gravel on it. Those days it was just mud trails. There was no gravel on the roads. And then when your grandparents moved to Missouri, they had an auction. I was over there at the auction. And there were sale bills, unfortunately, as far as I know. I don't have any. I don't think anybody else does either. But they used to hand those out. They'd be on colored paper, various colors of paper listing the equipment that was for sale. It'd be nice if they had one, but there isn't any. But anyway, after the sale, they came over and stayed with us for a while. Well, the weather got bad, so they were over there quite a while. Shirley stayed with merchants because she was still in school, and she went to the current school. Doug wasn't in school yet, so Doug and his parents stayed with us, and we had a lot of fun. We couldn't go anywhere, but I remember one night we decided to make taffy. Well, nobody knew how to make taffy. So upstairs in the attic was a trunk full of old magazines. So we went up there with a flashlight. There was no light in the attic to see if we could find a recipe for taffy. The very first magazine we pulled out of the trunk had a recipe for taffy in it. So we made taffy. First time I ever had it. And we'd make popcorn balls and all kinds of stuff. And then finally the weather got better and the moving van could get over there to get the furniture, and so they left and drove down to Springfield. As I recall, they stayed in a motel the first night until things got unloaded into the house. And then we used to go down there and visit them periodically, and they'd come up here once in a while. It was a little hard to do with farmers, you know. You have to milk the cows twice a day, every day, so it's hard to be gone. But I do remember when Donnie was born, Louise and I stayed over there, and she cried all night that night. You know, it was we went over at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she was just little. What were you, 2 then? Yeah, 2 years old. She didn't like that. But anyway, we stayed there for several days. In those days, when a child was born, the mother stayed in the hospital for at least 9 days, which is hard to believe now. But they did, and we had great fun. While we were over there, Fred took us to the circus. Shirley and I went, and Peggy and Dick, and we went in this old 1937 International pickup. First circus I'd ever been to. It was in the ballpark in Sioux City. And Aunt Gertrude, I don't think we picked her up. I think she met us down there. She must have taken the bus. But anyway, she was with us, so we had a grand time. In those days, the animals were in a tent. You could go into a tent, and the only thing between the people and the elephants was a velvet rope, like they have in a theater or something, you know. So you could feed peanuts to the elephant. The elephant would stick out his trunk and put a peanut on it, and he'd eat the peanuts. Of course, now that'd be absolutely, totally unheard of for liability reasons, if nothing else. But things were a little different in 1945. I remember having to wait in line quite a while, and it was raining lightly that day. But we had fun. It was the first circus I ever went to. And matter of fact, I think it was I did go to 1 or 2 tent circuses after that, but this was a big circus. It was in a tent, you know. It wasn't in an auditorium. It was a big circus, and that was a momentous event. So that pretty much brings us up to the present, as far as I can remember.
Do you want to take a little break, Ronnie?
Yeah, let's.
You've been talking for about an hour.
Yeah. No, I can talk.